Welcome to the Academy of Esports podcast. I'm your host, James O'Hagan. I am so excited because I've talked about this book many times. I've even done a whole podcast episode about this book where I kind of broke it down chapter by chapter. It's one of the few books that I've ever taken notes on and gone back and actually looked at the research and everything that's inside of it. I'm here with Dr. Chris Ferguson from Stetson University, which is down in Florida, and he's one of the authors of the book, Moral Combat, Why the War on Violent Video Games is Wrong. Chris, thank you so much for being on the Academy of Esports podcast today.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It's awesome. I appreciate the invitation.
And I'm sure that the book was written about, was it about 2 years ago, 3 years ago? Actually, it's 3 years ago now, I believe.
3 years. Yeah, time passes quickly. Yeah. And
I think the world has changed in a lot of their perceptions about video games and where video games fit into our culture. But let's back up to 2017 and let's look at what the world was like in 2017 and where video games were kind of sitting as far as the perceptions of it. So kind of give us a little background or a jump start into the book itself, if you will.
Yeah, sure. So myself and Patrick Markey, who's the other author of the book, have both been involved in doing research on video games for, goodness, it's probably been getting close to 2 decades at this point, which is really scary to think about. But yeah, we've been doing research on this in a while. We kind of had seen, and most of it on like the violence and video game debate. And we've seen these debates go back and forth for really quite a long time. And from the time that we both started, which was in the early 2000s, doing research in this area, we saw this like kind of a gradual change from video games being like the equivalent of cigarettes, in terms of like well-being for kids, to, certainly not like a full embrace of them yet, but certainly sort of like the real concerns kind of easing off gradually, over time. So we thought it would be good to help the general public understand kind of what is actually happening in the research and perhaps even in the political sphere a little bit in terms of like, you pick up the newspaper and you read games like heroin or, games are associated with shootings. Then you read another article that says that they're wonderful and they teach like visual spatial skills and kind of like wonder what, this is kind of like eggs, I guess, right? They're really bad for you one day and they're good for you the next day.
Great way to say it. Yeah.
But we really want to say like, what does the research really look like and how did we get to this spot? Where there are all these kind of like crazy claims being made in newspaper articles, and why is there so much debate and disagreement among the scholars in the field? And we wanted to make it fun. We wanted to make it something that wasn't too inside baseball, I guess you might say. It wasn't too difficult or scholarly or like technical or that kind of thing, but still was research focused and data focused, and we had a lot of fun writing it and hope that people would have a lot of fun reading it. But yeah, we really just kind of wanted to provide people an inside glimpse of what research in video games, whether that's on violence or pathological gaming, what some people call addiction, or other things, look like, and also tackle the positive side. Are games really going to cure your like Alzheimer's disease or make your IQ 20 points higher than it otherwise would have been? So sometimes you get some exaggerated claims on the other side as well. So we kind of wanted to look at that and give people at least like a general view of what the data actually said on some of these issues.
And it's interesting because to kind of dive into the research, and when you start to present it, you start to see that there are some very clear agendas that a lot of the research is agenda driven. And I don't know if that's obviously just for this. I mean, we've seen agenda driven research when it comes to things like smoking, again, even the commercials in the 50s and 60s where it was like 4 out of 5 doctors recommend, Lucky Strikes or whatever it is, or as you said, even the research on eggs and how people would start to seize on those things, or even a couple of years ago, gluten-free, Atkins diets, those kind of things. So there's always agendas that are driven. But fast forward going from 2017 now, have we started to see a shift in some of that research, and have we started to see a shift in the narrative in just the 3 years since, especially with the rise of esports, and now that we're all kind of stuck in home and a lot of people are playing a lot more video games than they were before?
Yeah, absolutely. There has been like one really big shift, and this is kind of like the narrative of the last 4 years is like really everything's Trump's fault, right? Whether you like him or not, right? He's either gets the benefit or the blame depending on your perspective. But I think before 2017, a lot of the criticism of video games, which mainly comes from older adults. I mean, that's probably not a surprise, right? This is like an old people issue, and I'm getting old too, so I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but so I've got my cane ready to wave at people as they cross my front lawn. I think I've already done this at some point, so I'm getting there. But it used to be bipartisan, so you can find these examples of like Hillary Clinton and Joe Lieberman and certainly Republican
Tipper Gore with the music thing in the 80s.
Absolutely, which was a lot of that was Al Gore and his wife Tipper. So you kind of see these bipartisan claims, and the one thing that's sort of interesting is in the last few years, President Trump has occasionally come out after a shooting like the one down in South Florida a couple years ago, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and kind of said, video games are to blame. And that like instantly shifted everybody on the left into the pro video game camp. And I'm not sure that was for the right reason. But
interesting. Yeah.
I'm not sure that was an informed move necessarily, but it was the I guess we'll take it. I mean, so I think the Republicans have managed to make it a partisan issue in the last few, so that they decided to own this issue of blaming video games for violent crime, or at least the president and some of his supporters have done this. So now this has become a much more partisan issue than issues of violent media ever have been, in the past. And then as you said, I mean, certainly there has been, a rise in esports. So that's, a lot of families have kind of gotten used to their kids playing games, and this being actually a productive thing, that it's a sport, it's something that they, can do socially at school and get accolades for, as opposed to it just being kind of like the hobby you did on your own in your basement with the shades drawn and a bowl of Doritos next to you and that kind of thing, to play on the stereotype. And then of course, what we're going through now, the whole sense of like, we don't have much else to do, and so kids are stuck at home. I have a 16-year-old. He had to go through virtual school, which he hated. He did great, but he hated it.
My children too.
Yeah.
And I oversee a virtual learning program, and my children hate it.
Okay, yeah. So always rewarding for your kids to love what you do. Yeah. So to stay in contact with their friends, they didn't, have much other option. I mean, that's one of the ways that my son stays in touch with his friends is through gaming. He's gone back to Minecraft, which he kind of abandoned for a while because he could play that with his friends and such. So I think we're seeing our kids use video games a lot more because oftentimes, at least with virtual school, they can get it done in a couple hours a day. Then have the whole rest of the day. Yeah. And and there's not much else to do. My son likes to walk around outside. We have a pool, he can walk around the track. But other than that, to keep socially connected, games and other technology are really the only thing that can make that work. And so we're going to see our kids use games and other technology a lot more even than they had in the past. They already have been using them quite a bit in the past, and not explode. Right. So I think that this is going to be a part of the process of people recognizing that technology in general is not as bad as like some newspapers or television shows have made games out to, or politicians have made games out to be. So I think it might have, nobody wanted it to happen this way, but it may force some reckoning with technology for people to kind of say, like, certainly you want to moderate it, you want to keep it in balance and everything else, but technology is not this evil boogeyman that for like literally 2,500 years people have seemed to want to make it into, and that'll last a couple years until some new technology comes along, and everybody be scared of that too. But
that's interesting. You bring that up, because I know when I was growing up, because you talk about this in the book, the evils of Dungeons and Dragons, and that was the big boogeyman in the 70s and 80s. And I remember when I was a child watching a 60 Minutes episode on Dungeons and Dragons from the early 80s. And you can go onto YouTube now and find that, and it's almost hilarious to see the claims that are being made. What was interesting also in the early 80s was there was a Dungeons and Dragons cartoon that was on Saturday mornings where they tried to introduce all the different types of characters. It was a violent game, but it was also one of the highest rated cartoons of the Saturday mornings in like the 83, 1982, 83 era. And I remember it very well. But there was another thing you brought up too. you talked about the politicization of this, and it's interesting. The Obama administration really tried to dig into this, and specifically Joe Biden. And I believe you were part of that group that met with Biden to kind of explain to him, here's the real research, here's what's really happening with this. And they really changed their tune after that. Wasn't that the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, my impression from those meetings, and it's just my impression, obviously, is that, the Obama-Biden, administration really was interested in gun control. But they had this strategy, which I don't think, it didn't work. I mean, we know it didn't work. But, but I don't think it was a great strategy. But they were kind of like going to throw mud at the wall and see what stuck, So they didn't want to feed into the narrative that Democrats were all about gun. Even though they were, so they wanted to do everything. We're going to tackle mental health, we're going to tackle gun control, we're going to tackle video games. So it made it look like they were trying to look like we're going to do everything, and take everything seriously. And I think that was a mistake because it didn't make their opponents happy. So it didn't stop people from criticizing their, the perceived attack on gun ownership rights, and at the same time, they failed to sort of like stop the use of video games to suck oxygen out of the room, which is kind of how a lot of people now use the video game argument, is to basically get people to talk about video games after a shooting event and not talk about things like gun control or even mental health, which is not as interesting, I guess, to a lot of people. So there is that sense of this sort of like, a deliberate politicization of the video game issue in order to distract people from talking about gun control. And I think that the Obama-Biden administration kind of failed to anticipate that and do anything about it. In meeting with Biden, I think he was pretty clear. He didn't care about video games. That was not his main focus. But the meeting was very much the Joe Biden show. So it really was this idea that we were all had like 2 minutes to talk, but he spent most of the time like talking and pontificating.
Gotcha.
Which I think fits kind of everybody's impression of Joe Biden. That's not probably a surprise. He's a smart guy and he kind of knows what he wants, but it was interesting because my favorite sort of anecdote from that was he had gotten some information from somebody because he had met with other groups of stakeholders of various sorts. And somewhere along the line, someone had told him, which people have been saying this kind of quote for literally forever, the sort of idea that kids younger and younger are engaged in naughtier and naughtier behavior. So there's always been this idea that like kids younger and younger are more violent, smoking, having sex, doing whatever they're not supposed to be doing. I mean, if all those claims were true, kids ought to be like popping out of the womb with a gun in one hand and a cigarette in the other at this point. So, but people have been like this is like a talking point people have used, and usually it's cops or like public. Not public defenders, but prosecutors. Usually law enforcement kind of use this sort of talking point, even though they don't know what they're talking about.
Sure.
So at that moment, I actually stopped him, and then I told him that he, in this room of people, it's like Eric Holder was there, and a bunch of other, of his age were there, and just told him he was wrong, and I actually had a graph that I brought.
Well, that's really nice of you to do to the Vice President of the United States.
I've been waiting for my IRS audit ever since. I swear to God. He was just dead ass wrong. You know what I mean? Because I had the graph right there. So I was like, okay, this is a good time for me to show you this graph because you're totally off base with this. Whether he appreciated it or not, I don't know, but I don't think he did. But yeah, so I mean, it points out like just how misinformed a lot of people are, including in this case, the Vice President of the United States, who may become our next president, on this particular issue. I don't think he cared a lot, but again, that's pretty much what he said, is that he didn't really care a whole lot about the video game issue one way or another, but that he really was interested in gun control because that's kind of been his signature issue for decades. But yeah, and I think at that point they kind of, I wouldn't say they dropped it, but they put less emphasis on it from that point on. They never really, which I think was a shame, they never really came out and just said like, no, this is not an issue and we should really focus on other things, which I think actually would have been smarter if they had done that. It wouldn't have made their opponents very happy, but their opponents weren't happy anyway.
Sure.
So I don't think there was any downside in just calling what they were interested in out, much more bluntly than they did. So yeah, and then like I said, since then it's been the Trump show, and then whenever he's raised it, I don't want to get too much into modern politics, and I try to, but there is a sort of sense of like if one side says that grass is green, the other side will say it's red, and like, whoever is right doesn't really matter. It's just they have to be the exact opposite of each other. But in this sense, I think it was sort of semi-useful in moving half the population over clearly into not thinking video games cause mass shootings at very least, which is correct. They might be correct again for the wrong reason, but at least they're correct.
Well, you bring up an interesting point about the politicization of things. Even in our day and age right now, face masks have kind of become like affiliations. If you wear a mask in public, you're buying into the fear culture versus I'm going to go out there and conduct my business however I want, and so on and so forth. But I think the question I have for you though is, back on that violence in video game connection, which we know if you read the book, you will find out that there is no connection. Again, I think the example you use is no scientist has ever overseen somebody who in a study plays a violent video game, gets up, goes over and smacks somebody or commits a violent act against somebody else. That's never been observed. But has the conversation started to shift? And the big question is the population aging out of the question? I'm 44 years old. I've grown up playing video games. I'm now in positions of leadership in a school district where I can start an esports program, promote the use of gameplay. And we play games like Overwatch and League of Legends, Smash Brothers, Rocket League. And people might say three of those games are violent in some regard. But I can also say I played a bunch of violent video games. In fact, while we've been playing, having all this time to play games, I think I finished Grand Theft Auto 5, the whole storyline in this, and I don't feel any more violent than I did before. So is the population, I guess, aging out, and is the conversation now starting to shift?
Yes, absolutely. There definitely is that aspect of it. So, death is a great mover of moral panics, essentially. That, moral panics are definitely generationally like anchored, right? So if you look at like what people were afraid of, even in the 80s, like I said, rock and roll music is a great example. Like, there were like Tipper Gore and Al Gore and other people, bipartisan, in Congress were afraid of like literally Prince and AC/DC and Tom Petty and AC/DC.
They were scared of, I know, they were scared of Prince.
Yeah.
I can't believe that.
Yeah, and what was it, Cyndi Lauper? She had that song about masturbation, right? That everybody thought was going to send teens running around masturbating in the streets and stuff. But so it is ridiculous. And we look back and go, come on, this is really kind of silly. So what happened is not that the people from the 80s who worried about that stuff changed their mind. They died. That's what happened to them. So now nobody. So if you go to an Ozzy Osbourne concert, which is actually becoming essentially impossible because he has Parkinson's disease. But but if you were to go to like any of those like old like scary Satanist rocker, like Alice Cooper or something like that, who was kind of like Muppet Satanism, I guess. But it's all like 70-year-olds that are going to these, so the old people from the 80s are dead, and so their concerns sort of died off, with them. And now you have all these, old people that, sort of were teenagers or in the 20s or 30s that grew up with that stuff that think that heavy metal music is fine. The idea that heavy metal music causes like Satanism and suicide and violence is stupid, and that's kind of what happens. But unfortunately, like the narrative sometimes shifts. So people shift either from, rock and roll to video games, and from video games to smartphones and this kind of stuff, or you get these like weird, like this is one thing I have been seeing in the last 4 or 5 years, these weird like mirror narratives, where it used to be like conservatives that were upset with Dungeons and Dragons, and now it's like the far left that's upset with Dungeons and Dragons because orcs are racist, or that kind of thing. I don't know if you've come across some of that stuff.
I have not yet. No,
I'm not making this up. So it's the same argument. that there's something in the game that's morally corrupting and it's going to like damage youth. Same argument as the 80s with Satan panics and that kind of stuff and demons and whatever. But now it's this idea, well, you're defining a race, biologically as being evil and this sort of thing, and that's going to promote racism in real life. There's no evidence of this.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still the same kind of very hyper moralistic narrative coming from one side or another one. And it's all about sort of imposing one's moral views on others, but it does tend to be very generational, and usually when that cohort of people ages up and then eventually dies, people think it's kind of stupid, to worry about that thing, whatever that thing was. So, well, you did whatever the next technology is.
Well, and you did bring up one of the other points too in this is you brought up the idea of racism in the discussion. Because I believe it was in the book where you kind of laid out the argument that white suburban culture always is looking for a reason or an answer to why did this happen? Why did our quote unquote safe community have this violent action happen? Whereas there's living in Wisconsin, where I do now, but I used to teach on the south side of Chicago. And there's shootings there every day. Nobody was going there looking for gaming consoles or PCs to find out, are these people playing video games all day? But again, that was more of the racist prejudice stereotype of, well, that's the ghetto and those things are regularly happening there anyway. That can't be it. But in our little lily white suburban culture, we don't have mental health issues. Everybody's happy. We all take our, Stepford Housewives and all that other stuff. There is that component in this argument as well, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. And it's been actually empirically demonstrated. I think, my co-author Patrick was involved in a research study with a few other folks that kind of looked at this and this idea of like when you see crimes committed by, a youth, where do you tend to place the blame? And essentially, there was a higher tendency to place the blame on external factors like video games, violence in video games, when a perpetrator is white, as opposed to being, particularly African American or Latino. Mm-hmm. So there again, there is a sense of like, probably some of it is like not caring about inner city crimes, probably part of that. The sense of, well, as long as it's happening somewhere in Chicago, I don't live there, so that's okay. And the sense of like, having this perception of the people around us in our in-group, as essentially being morally good, right? So if something, it doesn't necessarily mean that we think that people in the out-group are morally bad, but we have this sort of general sense of people in in-group as being morally good. And so if someone in our in-group, someone in our suburban neighborhood, for instance, does something way out of character from what we expected they should do, we are more likely to blame that on some kind of corrupting influence, that something must be happening to the kids that isn't our parenting, that isn't our society, that must be a corrupting influence, whether that is, video games or rock and roll music or comic books or radio or Greek plays, all these things have been blamed. So it's a comforting narrative that allows us to maintain our sense of our own sort of like in-group as being morally good, and just under threat from something outside. We're always kind of keyed, and it's probably something evolutionary, right? We're just wired to think this way, that we're always worried about threats from the outside rather than being introspective about what things we might be doing or maybe could do better within our own families or our own culture and that sort of stuff. And like I said, I think it's just an evolutionary way that we have adapted to thinking.
Well, and too, there's shame in that. I mean, let's get down to that. I mean, shooting happens in your community and you're looking for every reason as to why it happened. There's a sense of vulnerability and shame that a lot of people are not really tuned in to accept and deal with, because again, there's flaws involved in there. There's again, shame is such a powerful thing that I don't think we talk a whole lot about, but kind of helps with I guess is something that maybe should be looked at a little bit closer when, again, you don't want to seem weak at all or vulnerable in these instances. Yeah. But let's kind of shift a little bit because as, again, we are staying in our homes more and more right now, screen time is becoming an interesting topic because, the question I always got before from parents was, well, how much screen time should I allow my kids? And I know that the guidelines have shifted even in the last 6 months where, there were certain things, but with screen time, there's also now parents I know who are worried about gaming addiction because again, they're getting their homework done in 4 or 5 hours. And what are they doing? Well, they're going into Fortnite, which Fortnite has become an amazing social media platform more than a game. There's more people, I think, meeting up. There's concerts going on in there. Has that, first of all, to kind of maybe help parents understand and educators as well, what exactly is video game addiction? And is it one of these things that's more overly self-diagnosed or overly given as an answer to what more likely is just kids intrinsically wanting to do something and it's not really damaging at all?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question, and of course a really, really complicated answer.
Thank you for being on the podcast. No, I was kidding.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned like the Fortnite. I mean, I've heard these stories about like adults having work meetings in Red Dead Redemption 2, which is a fascinating idea. For they just sit around the campfire, with the wolves howling at night and just talk through whatever. I think it's just a fascinating idea. I never would have thought of that, but it's all good. So I mean, first off, there's not even agreement. I mean, you referred to this as video game addiction. A lot of people say we shouldn't use addiction language because it sort of conveys something similar to substance abuse to a lot of people, where these are not really the same thing. Even if it exists, it's not the same thing as a substance abuse disorder. There's no substance involved. There's no physiological tolerance or withdrawal or any kind of symptoms like that. Some people, or a lot of people, prefer pathological gaming or something of that sort, which kind of makes it its own thing. So I mean, we could probably talk for hours into like the inside baseball of the video game, pathological gaming research field. It's honestly kind of, I mean, the 50-cent version is just really kind of a dumpster fire, and that nobody agrees. No, sir, I'm serious. People have been doing this for like 40 years.
A psychological dumpster fire.
It's psychological. Well, the field is a dumpster fire. I'm not talking about what people are experiencing it. The field of research is a dumpster fire. And what I mean is that nobody agrees on what the symptoms are or how to define this thing. There's probably like 40 or 50 different ways of measuring it, which is absurd. That's not good. So it's measured different ways by different scholars. So nobody agrees what the prevalence of it is. So there are all these like very basic questions about this thing that like there's just continual disagreement about. So there is an official diagnosis that WHO came up with that a lot of people don't like. Some people do like. The DSM has a different version with different symptoms that don't look like they work very well for the most part. They don't distinguish people that have problems versus people that don't have problems very effectively. So that's what I mean by it's a dumpster fire. There's really just like no central set of like rules that scholars agree with, even in terms of like defining what this thing is, which makes it really, really difficult to talk about. Like when you ask like, well, how prevalent is it? I don't know. Depends on what list of symptoms you use. You can find prevalence estimates ranging from less than 1% through like 30% of people. And I don't think 30% of people are addicted to video games. The world would come crumbling into pieces if that were true, at least in the sense of them being unable to function. But
sure.
So, I mean, a central element I think that might help parents understand is that there's not agreement about whether this is its own mental health condition versus something that people do when they're already depressed or anxious or have ADD or something of that sort. In other words, like the example was, people that have depression oftentimes stay in bed for more hours than is normal, but we wouldn't say they have bed addiction necessarily, right? So is the playing of video games something that is more akin to that, where they're using video games to kind of like feel better when they're depressed, or is it something the games have done to them that have made them, less functional for one reason or another? And there's not agreement among scholars on that key issue. What we can say is that, the 30% numbers aside, it looks like this is a pretty rare thing, so we're probably talking 3 to 1% of gamers experiencing anything like problems related to their gaming. So most people are not going to have trouble, with this. The things to look for, and this is true for adults or kids, is the individual getting enough sleep? Binging occasionally is normal. So sometimes you get the first day you get a new game, you're going to maybe play too much of it. That's fine. But are they generally able to get enough sleep? excuse me, are they getting either their schoolwork if they're a kid or regular work done if they're an adult, and are they getting adequate exercise? So that's actually easier for kids than for adults because a lot of adults don't exercise, but it has nothing to do with gaming. But that's kind of the things to look for. Are they getting exercise like they should? Are they sleeping, which for minors is at least like 9 hours, 10, sometimes people say 10 hours a day. And are they getting done what they need to get done, which is either school or work. If that's, and are they basically happy, within, nobody's happy all the time, right? But are they generally looking within normal parameters in terms of happiness? So as long as those 4 criteria are basically in place, then your kid doesn't have a problem with games. Essentially, there's no magic hours, So if during the pandemic, like I said, like my kid can get his stuff done in school. He's done now, but he could get his stuff done within like an hour and a half, every day. And he likes to walk around the pool anyway, so he gets his exercise. He sleeps weird hours, but he sleeps plenty. And he's pretty happy. So does it matter if he plays like 6 or 8 hours of video games a day? No, not really. As long as these other things are all kind of coming together, for him. Because he doesn't have a lot of other options. He can't go hang out with his friends. He can't do things in real life. He can't, engage in clubs or sports or that kind of stuff in real life. So it's not like, your kid hits a certain like 2 hours a day. You have to stop them and have them like stare at the paint on the walls all day for the rest of the day. Avoid them, sort of breaking down. So that's really a thing to look for. And again, even if your kid is saying, is above parameters on those things. In other words, they're not getting enough sleep, they're not getting enough exercise, they are struggling with their homework, whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean games did it to them. They may be spending more time on games than those other things, and that may not be a great balance. But it may be because they have an underlying depression, anxiety, ADD. So taking away the games might not be the solution to the kid's actual problem. That doesn't mean to ignore it. That may be a red flag or a warning sign that there's something going on there that you do want to pay attention to. But in terms of like, well, I'll just take the Xbox away and everything's going to be okay. The evidence that, at least the way I see the evidence, it doesn't appear to be the case. That usually when kids have problems with pathological gaming, it stems from some combination of pre-existing mental health disorders like depression, anxiety, ADD, as well as stress, and a lot of that stress comes from parents and schools. So they're reacting to bad stuff either happening internally or happening in their social world, and they retreat to a gaming universe because games are fun.
Well, and that gets into, I look at things from a educational standpoint. I'm very much a self-determination theorist, where there's the levels of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. This is where I'm doing my doctoral research, and looking at the intrinsic motivational factors. For example, they have a sense of competency, meaning they know what they're doing in these spaces. They have a sense of relatedness because they've built their communities, and they have a sense of autonomy because they can control what they're doing. Kids walk into school nowadays, they're told to sit down and be quiet. They're told to, here's what you're going to learn. And they're told this is how you're going to learn it. And there's very little freedoms there. And it's when you look at the Pew Research and it's saying 97% of boys and 83% of girls are playing video games, not in an esports sense, but just video games in general. And that could be as simple as whatever dumb little thing you got on your phone versus, you've got a PC rig and all that other stuff. There's that intrinsic motivation is such a powerful thing. And if there's nothing else that's intrinsically motivating you to move on from that or do anything else, of course, you're going to want to me, stay with, unless you have your responsibilities and your sense of responsibility and those things. And I always caution people too, because now esports is becoming the big thing and schools are really starting to embrace it in a lot of ways, but there's this huge rush to implementation. And I say to them, be very careful about how you implement esports in your schools, because once you start putting extrinsic motivations on kids, you can actually start to shift their intrinsic love of something to an extrinsic, and now it becomes more of a work, and it becomes more like, for me, the example I give is when I was in 7th, 8th grade, freshman in high school, I loved playing baseball, but I loved playing baseball sandlot style. Like, I could crank a home run. The pitches were, easy to hit, but I tried out for the baseball team. I hated every second of it. And there was that extrinsic, like, well, you have to run. Well, I don't have to run when I play with my sandlot friends. I can hit the ball a mile and I don't have to go anywhere. So I really look at this time too as saying, that there's the psychological things, and then for the educators, there is again that self-determination theory part that is so enticing, and how can we use it and leverage that intrinsic motivation to get kids involved in school versus let's use it as that gamification, which really can screw up a lot of things, I guess.
Right. Yeah. 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 I think it can be, a bit of a tricky thing, like you said. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's all this research that points to this. If a person is doing something because it's fun for them, the minute you start to like pay them for it, right, then it becomes work, and they won't. The fun is lost, in a way, and and that can be kind of a challenging thing. I mean, I know like so at least my impression is what a lot of people that are sort of interested in esports, they really do want to make it into like a profession, and of course it's like a lot of things. I'm sure, you probably are aware of this or tell your students this, that it's kind of like wanting to be a professional sport athlete of any kind, right? The odds of actually succeeding at it are fairly, fairly low.
Yeah.
Would be my impression in terms of like making an actual career, making money that you can support yourself, on something like that. So yeah, you probably get like if some of the kids are really driven towards that goal, but you also probably do get some that, hey, I like playing League of Legends and a lot, and maybe I'll just hang out with a bunch of other people that like to play with it a lot too. And there may be a difference between people who are interested in like a club, really what they want is a video game club, where they can kind of hang out with a bunch of other people and play games and socialize and have fun, as opposed to esports, where it's going to be, like I said, a lot more extrinsic, winning competitions, competitive, and that kind of stuff, which is a very different ball game. And you have to practice, I mean, I don't know how many hours is typical, but, an absurd amount of hours, doing the same thing over and over and over again to get really, really good at it, and that may take some of the sort of intrinsic fun out of it. But on the other hand, we're talking about self-determination theory. It does give people a sense of competence. On the other hand, so it really, I think, depends on what a particular individual is hoping to get out of it. Are they really just trying to do the fun thing more and have that sort of be official, and that's okay, or do they really want to be a competitor in that thing? And it might help to think, in terms of like I believe at Stetson we have both like an esports club, which is really like the guys and girls that want to be competitive. And we also have like a gaming club, which would be like what I would do if I were that age, which is, I really suck at a lot of games, but I'd like to hang out.
I'm terrible. I tell people avoid having me on your team. I'm the worst gamer.
So it might be helpful to have spaces for both, right? For the people that just kind of want to hang out and, they're motivated. Myself versus like I really want to try to see if I can make a career out of this and play competitively and win. I don't care what game I'm playing. I just want to play one I'm really good at so I can beat other people and get money. That's a very different set of motivations, and so I think you're absolutely right. That there's importance in being able to distinguish between those groups of people and give them each an opportunity, to indulge those motivations, which again, thinking in terms of self-determination theory, those are two very different sets of motivations. One is more social, one is more competitive or competence. You put the wrong. I've never been a competitor at like anything, to be honest with you. Never been good at any sports or anything.
For me, it's rugby. For me, that's mine. But video games, I'm just god awful.
Yeah. But yeah, go ahead.
Even talking about Stetson, and it's important to note that you said you do have your gaming club and you do have your more competitive. There was a story that I don't know how much of a story it is. It's kind of, I think, building right now, where University of South Florida, Tampa, launched their esports team at the same time they defunded their video game club.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
And to me, it's like this is the one piece of advice that I give people. If you already have a gaming club in your schools, don't touch it. Don't try to turn it into something it's not, because again, the need for gaming, especially when we're in a city like mine where I live in Racine, where mental health issues, 60% of adults have had at least one adverse childhood experience in Racine, which means their children have probably had that adverse childhood experience as well too. Right. And we know that, two ways that you can push against a mental health crisis. One is with a positive adult interaction, and the other one is through play. We need to give these kids opportunities to play at every spot that they can. But for the parent who comes to me, and again, your book I highly recommend it. It's a book that I have, again, taken notes, and I keep those notes and I review it, and I review your resources, which I think are excellent. If I have a parent who comes to me today, especially now, let's say you're speaking to an educator who's thinking about starting an esports club, and you've said, okay, look at my book, and you say, I haven't had time to read it, but I have this parent who needs me to answer them tomorrow. And they're very concerned about the violence in the games that we are playing.
Yeah.
How can we, I guess, frame the conversation best for that teacher who may be facing that conversation with a parent, or vice versa, a parent who just isn't sure, their friends are talking about it on Facebook or whatever, how do they, I guess, frame the conversation in this
source of information? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I have those too. I mean, my favorite is I have these old college friends that they probably are regretting they ever asked me some questions, but I always see it's a story. But yeah, they were like just regular kids in their day, right? They listened to heavy metal. Well, I don't know if they listened to heavy metal, but they listened to the music that adults didn't like, and did naughty things like college students do that they shouldn't, underage drinking or whatever.
I listened to so much NWA as a kid. Oh my gosh, in high school in California, it was NWA. And Public Enemy, gosh, I don't know if my parents ever knew that I listened. If anybody asked me, and I sorry to stop you for just a second, because I see this with kids. It's the icebreaker question that I ask kids. Just like if you said to me, what music do you play? I would have clammed up, and if my parents were around and said, well, NWA and Public Enemy. And I ask kids the question today, what video games do you play? And if their parents are around, they get really timid. They almost get like very closed mouth. They don't want it. And then some of the parents will be like, go on. And almost like the parents are rolling their eyes. Tell them what you play. It's such an odd dynamic, but please go. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, like, in this particular case there, I think he was maybe like 14. Their son started playing Grand Theft Auto 5. So they went online and looked up they were asking me like, oh, we read all this stuff online about how there's like rape and child molestation and necrophilia in the game. I'm saying like, I don't remember that.
I don't either.
So what happened is exactly like you said. They went online, they find a bunch of, obviously the game is not meant for minors, so it definitely has a lot of adult content in it, but it doesn't have that, that kind of, something to think about that. Would that be a fun game for you to play? I mean, is this what do you think? Like the gaming audience is looking for? A child molestation game? I don't think. There's a very niche audience, and AAA, producers aren't going to produce a game like that.
Right.
I'm sure you can dig around somewhere on the dark internet and Russia, something like that.
Don't do that. Everybody who's listening, don't go doing that.
But anyway, so you get a lot of bad information. So, I mean, you obviously don't want to ridicule, people because they'll shut down and get defensive, and that's not going to,
I've done that before, to be honest. Somebody started in on me with that conversation. I said, why are we even having the conversation?
Which is true for like everything, by the way. Even when I watch I don't mean to go off on a total tangent, but even like the mask thing, like the mask COVID, you see all these memes on both sides, and I try to tell people, and pardon my language, like when you start the conversation by calling someone an asshole, they don't listen more. You know what I mean? So so they can be dead wrong, but if you start by trying to listen to them and then give them data and information, or ask them like what could convince you to change your mind, that tends to go better. People are in general hard to convince. In fairness, persuasion is. I mean, the research is very clear. Persuasion is difficult. But giving people a middle finger isn't going to work for sure. So in general, you kind of want to like, okay, well, what, why are you concerned about this? Where did you get your information from? And then, you can certainly, suggest like, well, here's where the data is. As far as I'm aware of, the data at this point says certainly for like violence in society, there does not appear to be a link between video game violence and like violent crimes or bullying or really serious outcomes, even for like minor acts of aggression. And we're really talking about giving someone a spicy sandwich when they don't like spicy food, kind of a thing, like prank level stuff. The evidence doesn't appear to be very good that video games even necessarily do that. It's a little bit less clear, but so there's just not really a lot of data to support this kind of a narrative. And then I think that's usually where I sometimes, when I definitely have had these conversations, and I kind of ease in like, okay, think back to like when you were like 16, and you remember like music you listened to or movies you watched and that kind of stuff. And And do you remember what like older adults thought about that stuff back then? So is this feel kind of similar to like rock music in the 80s or rap music in the 90s or Dungeons and Dragons? Does any of this kind of like, remember like when you said you wouldn't be like your parents? Does it feel kind of like your parent? I mean, maybe you don't want to say that, but this is kind of like the gist you're trying to lead. Sometimes if you remind people about moral panics in history that they've gone through as kids, then they kind of go, oh yeah, I do remember when like Ozzy Osbourne was supposed to make me a Satanist, and I never did become a Satanist, did I? And that can sometimes help people to realize that this is kind of a cycle, and this is just kind of like what society does, is condemn new media and new technology, usually in irrational kinds of ways. But if you keep it into like, I understand your concern. Certainly many games are not meant for minors. They're not, they're designed for adults. There's ratings on the game package. If on the other hand, you do decide to take a risk, I don't know, maybe that's even putting it too strongly, but your kid wore you down, and they're 15 and you got the Grand Theft Auto, it's not going to be the end of the world. Your kid's going to be fine.
I have a really funny story to share about that. It's kind of related. I remember I was probably freshman in high school, maybe 8th grade. And my mother went to the video store and brought home this movie for us all to sit down and watch. It was going to be this big family night because she heard such wonderful things about this movie, and it was such a classic film. And we sit down and we start watching Rocky Horror Picture Show. My sister's in 6th grade. I'm in 8th grade. My father is sitting there for, I don't know, the first 10 minutes going, what are we watching? Like, what is this? This is terrible. And then we get to the scene where Tim Curry comes out dressed in drag with fishnets, and my mother starts going, no, we can't watch this. And of course, my father now is like, no, leave it on. This is great. I'm loving this. And actually, it's spawned a love that my father and I have for that movie. So it's funny that you should say, as parents, if you take that chance doesn't necessarily always have to be a bad thing either.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. That's certainly true. But yeah, I think that, well, I mean, one thing to keep in mind is I know this is going to be like good news for parents too, but you can take like the worst video game, like, I pick on Grand Theft Auto 5 because everybody knows it. Everybody knows that it's an adult, rated game, M-rated game. And you can take like the worst stuff that's in Grand Theft Auto 5, and they are hearing and seeing and experiencing that on steroids in middle school. You know what I mean? Like among their peers. There's nothing in a video game or in a book or in a movie that they aren't experiencing far worse among other middle school or high school people. And I can remember that from when I was in high school, and certainly, from what my son tells me about what he sees and experiences going back into middle school.
Well, how about English class? You don't even have to go to middle school. Just go to English class and some of the books that we read, and the mythology. I mean, I remember in 5th grade learning about, Greek mythology, and I'm like, wow, Zeus is kind of a gross dude,
Everybody's very rapey in Greek mythology. It's like a thing. I don't know what's up with the Greeks, but in fairness, they worried about that sort of stuff too. So there are these great examples of like from Plato's dialogues of the ancient Athenians worrying about Greek plays, causing delinquency, and it's basically why they killed Socrates. And now we like make kids read this stuff. They don't want to anymore. But we make them read it. But so I mean, you're not. The reality is you're not shielding your kid anyway. Unless you like homeschool them, and then maybe you are. But most of us will go a little crazy, homeschooling kids. It's great for people that can do it. I think most kids like a little separation, and parents probably like a little separation too. But unless you're homeschooling and like just like in control of everything your kid experiences, just the fact that they're going to go to public school is going to ruin it, in terms of your ability to shield them from like morally objectionable material. So they're not going to see anything in a video game they're not going to see in public school. Or private school,
So, Chris, if again, I'm a concerned parent or I'm an educator who's really interested in this topic, outside of the book Moral Combat, Why the War on Violent Video Games is Wrong, written in 2017 by you and Patrick Markey, where else would be a great place to get resources on something that I, as an educator or as a parent, can easily digest and read? Because obviously research studies are not going to be it. I find
Yeah.
APA has some pretty good stuff, but I also find that there's conflicting information sometimes,
Mm.
some of these websites. Is there a place where we could go to maybe get some of the latest information in digestible form that is simple for us to read?
There is literally no place else other than our book. No, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. No, it is hard. So because like you mentioned, like the APA, right? So the APA is basically run by old people, and I'm a fellow of the APA. I've been on the council of representatives before. It's the average age of the people in the room of the council of representatives is probably somewhere in their 60s, I would guess. So they don't know what the hell they're talking about when it comes to video games, and it shows. So their public statements, like you said, they're big controversial because they're rubbish, for the most part. So it can't, even with these professional guilds. So the American Psychological Association is a guild. It's not a science organization. It's not a government organization. They represent people like me, psychologists. We pay them money, and they're supposed to make our lives easier. I don't know if they do, but they're supposed to. So and the American Academy of Pediatrics is another great example, right? For many, many years, they said no more than 2 hours a day of screen time. Then eventually they figured out that was like horrible advice because nobody could live up to it, and they're just making parents feel guilty. And to their credit, they eventually dropped that in 2016. But no, those are not great sources of information. There really aren't a lot of super good sources. The Pew Research Foundation sometimes do some good stuff with video games. That's pretty digestible. If parents are interested in their kids looking for a particular game, if parents want to find out about it, of course, there's the ESR, the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, the ESRB rating system. They have a website, esrb.com, I think it is. It's either org or com. I can't remember. I think it's esrb.com.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Where you can look up the rating, the age rating for the game. I also would suggest if parents are considering their kid wants to buy a new game, Resident Evil. I don't know which one they're on. 3. They're redoing 3, I think. Yeah, Resident Evil 3. That sounds kind of I don't know. Yeah, what's in it? You can read reviews online, and I find the reviews oftentimes are very good because they're obviously trying to let players know whether the game's any good, but they oftentimes will describe the game in such detail you have a pretty good sense, even as a parent, of what you can expect your kid to come across in the game. So I think a lot of times in terms of does this game have edgy content or not, reading game reviews, which only take a few minutes, they're not long, can be very effective. But no, I mean, I was kind of being silly when I talked about our book being the only really good source. But no, it's actually it's part of the trouble that parents have is there really isn't a really great source out there of impartial, non-moral panicky. I mean, there's the industry, but of course they have their own agendas and stuff. They want everybody to buy as many games as possible.
Sure.
So it's hard to find a completely neutral actor in this area. I mean, like I said, the Pew Research Foundation people have been probably about as neutral as anybody has been in talking about things like video games and youth and that kind of stuff. It's not what they do all the time, but their reports on video games and technology have been pretty even-handed, I think. They're pretty digestible. I think I know you mentioned you've read some of them, and I think they're pretty easy for most people to read.
Yeah.
They're very descriptive as opposed to lots and lots of stats.
But even what you'll find with Pew, and I found this too, is you'll find one study in one graph, and then you'll find another study in another graph, and they'll almost, it's like, well, wait, I thought you said over here that it was this, and now over here it's this, which, because the question is slightly different. You almost have to read the question 4 or 5 times. Again, when people say, where do you get that 97% of boys and 83% of girls play video games, in the teenage range? And it literally, it was like one little graph at the bottom of a study, so not really the study, but the site that they did on top of everything else that they had. But it wasn't even in a video game study. It was in something else that they had done. Yeah. About social media connections or something like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. So it can be tricky. That's what makes it hard. I think, is parents, when they go out there and look for information, all they find out is like Fox News or CNN that, always tend to prefer the most salacious, horrifying. It was the same thing with Dungeons and Dragons, like you said, with the 60 Minutes episode that, it's funny I've watched it recently and it's hilarious. It's completely earnest, really earnest clip from 60 Minutes, which everybody respects, about like how Dungeons and Dragons was causing suicide. And so like nobody thinks is true anymore.
Right.
And
no, the only thing that Dungeons and Dragons does anymore is LARPing and creative writing. I mean,
yeah. And apparently racism, if you're really on the far left. But it's a thing. Look at we could provide some links to that argument. But yeah. And that's why I think it's always been tricky for parents to kind of navigate these issues. Like, back in the 80s, there wasn't really a great neutral, we had Tipper Gore. Right, mm-hmm. That was a source of information, and she was a terrible source of information. And Dungeons and Dragons, we had 60 Minutes, and they were a terrible source of information. And unfortunately, today parents have CNN or the Daily Wire if they're in the UK or whatever, and they're terrible sources of information because they're businesses too. And they have to sell, and they have to have headlines that people read. And, this is what your kid brain look like when they're playing video games, sells a lot more than video games. They don't do anything, that's just kind of the reality. So, and I think parents have to, or anybody, policymakers, whoever, need to realize that there's a flood of just horrible, horrible information out there. And then there's our book, which is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. I'm teasing again.
and I think it's important too to for parents to realize, because again, I connect with my children through gaming and gaming culture, and we play a variety of different things. And if you're an adult, and this is the advice I give to some parents: if you're an adult and you see your kid playing a bunch of video games, sit down with them next to the couch. You don't even have to ask them any questions. Just watch what they're playing, hang out with them for a bit. My kids finally allowed me after a while to play Overwatch with them, and I'm terrible. And eventually they had to tell me to stop playing because I was so bad, because I was making them lose. But it's those little things, those little bits of trust, those little bits of, my son now comes to me and says, "Hey, I'm really interested in this game. Let me tell you about it." And then we talk about, is this really an appropriate game for you? Do you think this is good for you to buy now? Or, it helps to, again, build trust and relationships that I think, especially now, especially that we're in our homes, especially that we're kind of on top of each other in a lot of cases, that we really develop those really powerful things. And I think, again, your book, your research, I'm hoping that somewhere along the way we have a volume 2, the addendum or something, because I feel, again, the research now is starting to shift tremendously, especially now as, again, we're starting to really recognize our mental health crises that we have across the United States, whether you're in a beautiful suburb or you're in a terrible, inner city situation, rural area, whatever. Those things are all important, and video games has a very important place in helping to, I guess, as part of the conversation, I should say.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Cool.
Well, Dr. Chris Ferguson of Stetson University, I'm so thrilled that you were able to make time for me tonight. Thank you so much for being on the Academy of Esports podcast today.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I had a lot of fun, and thanks for having me on tonight.
That will do it for this week on the Academy of Esports. I've been your host, James O'Hagan. Esports are organized competitive video games allowing schools to redefine their athletic culture, diversify opportunities for student participation, promote good physical and mental health, increase collegiate scholarship pathways, and play games. We can never forget the importance of play. The mission of the Academy of Esports is to support these ideals. The vision of the Academy of Esports is for all students to experience the fun and joy of playing competitive video games. You may follow me on Twitter at Jim O'Hagan. That's at JIMOHAGAN, and through the Academy of Esports account at TAO Esports. It's a great way to get the latest blog posts, podcast episodes, and news coming out of esports and education. And remember, you can continue your engagement by going to www.taoesports.com. You can also connect through Facebook at www.facebook.com/TAOesports. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to our time again next week.